Good day, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about something that every one of you has experienced and probably has strong feelings about it. That is, test. Specifically, paper and pencil test. Now, I know that some of you might be thinking, oh great, we're going to talk about test in class. But here's the thing, we're not talking about from the perspective of a student taking test. Today, we flip the table. We're going to look at the test from the perspective of the person making them, the teacher. So this chapter 5, we're covering sections of 5.2 through 5.4.2. By the end of our discussion today, you should have a solid understanding of the different types of paper and pencil tests, how to construct them properly, and very importantly, the common mistakes that make a test unfair, misleading, and or just plain bad. So, before we dive in, let me give you a quick roadmap of where we're heading. Think of this as your GPS for the lesson. So, first, under section 5.2, we'll talk about the general types of paper and pencil test, just to establish our foundation. Then, in 5.3, we go into the selected response type. These are the tests where you choose your answer from given options. This includes true or false test, multiple choice test, and matching type test. After that, section 5.4, we shift to the supply or constructed response type, where students have to produce the answer themselves. So this covers completion tests and essays. So each of these tests, these types has a specific guidelines, rules that teachers must follow when constructing them. And trust me, once you learn these rules, you'll never look at a poorly made test the same way again. Alright, let's get into it. 5.2 Types of paper and pencil test. So the first thing I want you to understand is this. Constructing a good test is a skill. It's not something you just sit down and do in 5 minutes. It requires careful planning and genuine expertise. That's the very first sentence of this section, and I want it to sink in. Now, let's talk about the different types briefly. We have true or false, multiple choice, matching type, completion, and essays. Each one has its strengths and weaknesses. So here's an interesting point the material makes. Experienced teachers can write true or false questions that test higher order thinking, not just simple recall. That surprises a lot of people, and we tend to think true or false is a simple test, right? Yes or no, true or false. But in the right hand, it can actually challenge students to think critically. On the flip side, we have essays. You might think essays are the hardest type of test to make, but actually, the text tells us that essays are easier to construct compared to objective tests like multiple choice. But, and this is a big but, even though they're easier to write, essays are harder to score. And that difficulty in scoring actually discourages many teachers from using them in practice. So the irony is this. The test type that can best assess deep thinking gets avoided because grading it is a headache. That's something worth thinking about as future educators. Okay, let's move on to the true or false test. So, this is also called the alternate response test or the binomial choice test. So the name binomial literally means two names or two options, and that's exactly what this test is. Items where students choose between exactly two possible responses. Now, the formats aren't limited to just true or false. You can also use right or wrong, yes or no, good or bad, even a check mark versus a cross. The point is only two choices. Now, here is the big problem with true or false test. And it's something every teacher must be aware of. Because there are only two options, the student who knows absolutely nothing about the subject still has a 50% chance of getting the correct answer just by guessing. Oh, think about that. If you randomly answer a 20-item true or false test without reading a single word, just flipping a coin, statistically, you'd get 10 items right. That's a 50%. Actually, simpler, right? That's a passing score in some grading system. So, how do we deal with this? Some teachers use what called a correction for guessing formula, which penalizes wrong answers. But the material tells us the best solution is right, true, or false items that can actually discriminate between students who know the content and those who are just guessing. So, in other words, write them well. So, another approach is modified true or false. So, in this format, students don't just say true or false. They also have to explain their answer. So, if a student says false but gives the wrong explanation, the answer doesn't count. So, this forces genuine understanding. You can't just guess your way to a correct explanation. So, clever, right? Let's now look at the specific rules for writing true or false items. Rule number 1. Do not give a hint in the body of the question. So, pay attention to this because they are among the most commonly violated rules. So, for example, the Philippines gained its independence in 1898 and therefore celebrated its centennial year in 2000. Now, if you know your history, 100 years after 1898 is 1998, not 2000. So the answer is false. But here's the problem. The question itself hints the answer by putting 1898 and 2000 side by side. So a student who doesn't know anything about Philippine independence can just do the arithmetic. 1898 plus 100 does not equal to 2000 and arrive at the right answer. So the item no longer tests knowledge, it tests arithmetic. That's not what we want. So, rule number 2, avoid absolute words like always, never, often, and similar terms. So here's the example. Christmas always falls on Sunday because it is a Sabbath day. So the answer is false. But here's the giveaway. The word always, as a general rule in test taking, statements using the word always are always false. And students who've been around long enough figure this out. So a test-wise student will just look for always or never and automatically answer false without knowing the content at all. So words to avoid: always, never, often, generally. These are what we call giveaways. They telegraph the expected answer to students who haven't studied. Okay, let's continue to rule number 3. Avoid long sentences as they tend to be true. Keep sentences short. So here's why this is a problem. Look at this example. Tests need to be valid, reliable, and useful. Although it would require a great amount of time and effort to ensure that tests possess these test characteristics. The answer is true. But notice, we're not entirely sure which part of the sentence the student considers true. What if a student thinks the second clause is debatable? They might mark it false. And in a different item, where one clause is false, a student could defensively answer either true or false. So a long sentence creates ambiguity. Short, clear statements always better. Rule number 4. Avoid trick statements, misleading words, spelling anomalies, misplaced phrases. This is a big one. So look at the example. The Raven was written by Edgar Allan Poe. The answer is false, but not because Poe didn't write The Raven. He did. The answer is false because the name is misspelled. The correct spelling is Alan, not Allen. Now, this might seem like a fun trick, but think about it. A student who knows literature perfectly well might mark this true without noticing the spelling. And a student who doesn't know anything about poetry but happens to notice the misspelling would mark it false and get it right. So, that's backwards. The item now rewards careless detail spotting, not subject knowledge. That makes a useless item. Rule number 5. Don't quote a verbatim from the textbook. So if you lift items word for word from the book, you're sending students a message that says memorize the text and you'll pass. That discourages deep thinking and promotes rote memorization. So higher order thinking skills like analysis, synthesis, and evaluation will never be developed or analyzed or assessed. So, rule number 6. Avoid specific determiners, the giveaway qualifiers. So we touched on this rule in number 2. But here's more nuance. Strongly worded statements using words like never, no, all, or always tend to be false. But moderately worded statements using words like many, often, sometimes, or generally tend to be true. So look at the example. Executives usually suffer from hyperacidity. The word usually is moderate. So the answer is likely true. A savvy student can guess correctly just from the qualifier. No content knowledge needed. Okay, rule number 7. Avoid patterns. If your answer goes TF, 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 students will figure it out and write the pattern to a perfect score without knowing a single thing. So mix up your true and false answers randomly. No sequences, no predictable patterns. Okay, finally, rule number 8. Avoid double negatives. So look at this. The changes that take place in early childhood are not unchangeable. You've got not and unchangeable. 2 negatives. So students have to stop, think, untangle the grammar, then answer the question. That's not a test of content. That's a test of grammar. So, rewrite it as the changes that take place in early childhood are changeable. Simple, clear, and direct. Okay, we are now moving into one of the most widely used test types in education, the multiple choice test. So unlike the true or false test, multiple choice gives students more than 2 options to choose from, and that alone already reduces the guessing advantage significantly. So every multiple choice item has 2 key parts. First is the stem. This is the question or the incomplete statement. It's the part that sets up the problem. Second are the options, one of which is the correct or the best answer, and the rest are called distractors. Now, let's talk about distractors, because this is where multiple choice construction gets interesting. So a distractor is a wrong answer that is specifically designed to look attractive to students who don't know the answer or are guessing, but have no appeal to students who actually know the content. So think about that. A well-crafted distractor is not just any wrong answer. It's a believably wrong answer. It should make a student who's unsure think, oh, that could be the right answer. But a student who truly understands the material should immediately see through it. And here's the key principle that applies to all types of tests, but especially for multiple choice. The difficulty of an item should come from the subject matter, not from confusing wording, unfamiliar terms, or misleading structure. So if a student gets it wrong, it should be because they didn't know the content, not because the question was written poorly. So, look at the rules. Okay, rule number 1. Do not use unfamiliar words, terms, and phrases. So, the ability of an item to discriminate between students who know and those who don't should come from the subject matter, not from the vocabulary. That's what I've mentioned earlier. So, here's the example. What would be the system reliability of a computer system whose slave and peripherals are connected in parallel circuits? So if a student doesn't know what slave and or peripherals mean in this context, they may fail the item, even if they fully understand the concept of system reliability. So that's unfair. Okay. Rule number 2. Don't use vague modifiers like much, often, or usually. So these words mean different things to different people. So for example, much of the process of photosynthesis takes place in the blank. What does much mean? Like 51%, 80%, 99%? So it should be replaced with something precise. 90% of photosynthetic process takes place in the blank. Now, everyone is working with the same understanding. Okay, rule number 3. Avoid complex or awkward word arrangements. And specifically, avoid negatives in the stem. So look at the poor example. As President of the Republic of the Philippines, Corazon Cuanco Aquino would stand next to which President of the Philippine Republic subsequent to the 1986 EDSA Revolution. So that's a mouthful. Students spend half their time just parsing that sentence. So here's a better version. Who was the President of the Philippines after Corazon C. Aquino? Short, clear, and direct. So the difficulty now comes from knowing the answer, not from decoding the sentence. Rule number 4. So rule number 4, it talks about do not use negatives or double negatives. Such statements tend to be confusing. It is best to use simpler sentences rather than sentences that would require expertise in grammatical construction. So, example. Which of the following will not cause inflation in the Philippine economy? The word not is easy to overlook. A student skimming the question might read it as will cause inflation and choose the wrong answer. Not because they don't know the content, but because they missed one small word. So the fix, remove the negative. Which of the following will cause inflation? And done. So example B, double negative. This is worse. What does the statement development patterns acquired during the formative years are not unchangeable imply? Not and unchangeable. Two negatives. So students have to first decode the double negative, realize it means unchangeable, and then answer the conceptual question. So we're testing the grammar more than their understanding of development. So the better version, what does the statement development patterns acquired during the formative years are changeable imply? Now, the student's mental energy goes entirely to the content, which is where it should go. Okay, rule number 5. Each item stem should be as short as possible. Otherwise, you risk testing more for reading and comprehension skills rather than subject matter knowledge. So, here's the classic example. The bad version goes something like this. So, the side opposite, the 30-degree angle in a right triangle is equal to the half the length of the hypotenuse. If the sine of a 30-degree angle is 0.5 and its hypotenuse is 5, what is the length of the side opposite the 30-degree angle? So that's a bad version. And the good version removes the unnecessary part. In a right triangle, the side opposite the 300-degree angle equals half the hypotenuse. If the hypotenuse is 5, what is the length of the side opposite the 300-degree angle? What was removed? The sine value, which is the 0.5. Why? Because the first sentence of the stem already tells you how to solve it. So the side equals half the hypotenuse. You don't need the sine formula at all. But by including it, the poor version distracts students and might even lead them to use a more complex calculation than necessary. So the rule of the thumb, if information in the stem isn't needed to answer the question, take it out. Rule number 6, 7, and 8. This is all about the options. So the choices you give to the students. Rule number 6. Distractors must be equally plausible and attractive. So it should be that all wrong answers should seem like they could be the right answer. So at least to someone who doesn't know the material. For example, the short story Mayday's Eve was written by which Filipino author? A. Jose Garcia Villa. B. Nick Joaquin. C. Genoveva Edrosa Matute. D. Robert Frost. E. Edgar Allan Poe. So options D and E, Robert Frost and Edgar Allan Poe, are obviously American writers, not Filipino. Any student can eliminate them immediately. So only 3 options are actually doing any work. A good distractor must be plausible. So replace Frost and Poe with other Filipino authors, and suddenly the item becomes much harder and much more meaningful. Rule number 7. All options must be grammatically consistent with the stem. So if you complete the sentence with an option and it sounds grammatically wrong, that's a clue and that it's incorrect. And the student hasn't even thought about the content yet. So for example, autos in 1980s blank. A. Traveling slower. B. Bigger interiors. C. To use less fuel. D. Contain more safety measures. So only D completes the sentence grammatically. So grammatically aware students can get it right without knowing anything about cars. So that's a bad design. Rule number 8. The length or technicality of an option should not hint at the correct answer. So if a correct answer is short and all the distractors are long, students will notice. Likewise, if the correct answer is always the most technical sounding one, students will learn to just pick the longest, not the complex the students will learn to pick the longest, so most complex option. Okay. Rule number 9. Avoid stems that reveal the answer to another item. So this one is subtle but very damaging. So look at these 2 items side by side. Item A asks, who will most strongly disagree with the progressivist who claims that the child should be taught only what interests him. Just by reading this question, you already learn that progressivists focus on children's interests. So, when item B asks which group will most strongly focus its teaching on the interest of the child, the answer is obviously progressivist, because item A already told you. So, one item is literally giving away the answer to another. So, when writing a test, you need to review all items together to make sure they don't cross-contaminate like these items. Okay, rule number 10. Avoid synonymous options or options that overlap each other. So, for example, what causes ice to melt? A. Change in temperature. B. Changes in pressure. C. Change in chemical composition. D. Change in heat levels. Options A and D, change in temperature and change in heat levels, are essentially saying the same thing. The temperature and heat are synonymous here. So if one is right, so is the other. Now, you have an item with two correct answers, which is a serious problem. And even before reaching that conclusion, a smart student narrows the field just by spotting the overlap. So each option must be distinct and unique. Okay, rule number 11. Don't present items in the same sequence as they appear in the textbook. So, if your test follows the exact order of the chapters, test-wise students can use the sequence as a clue. So, they'll think the last answer was about topic A. So, this must be about topic B, which comes next. So, shuffle your answer. Okay, rule number 12. Avoid assumed qualifiers that students may not know. So, for example, under standard atmospheric pressure, water boils at blank. So, if students don't know what standard atmospheric pressure means, so the item becomes unfair. Not because the content is hard, but because of an assumed condition they weren't taught. So, be explicit about the context you're testing in. Rule number 13. Don't add unnecessary information to the STEM. So, we already covered this with rule number 5 using the sign example. So, extra information that is not needed to answer the question just clutters the item and tests reading comprehension instead of subject knowledge. Now, rule number 14. Don't create non-relevant sources of difficulty. So, if you're testing knowledge of a principle, don't require a complex calculation as part of answering it. The difficulty should be in knowing the principle, not in executing a separate skill that isn't what you're assessing. Rule number 15. Pack the question into the STEM. So every STEM should contain a clear answerable question. So look at this bad example. The Roman Empire blank. A. Had no central government. B. Had no definite territory. C. Had no heroes. D. Had no common religion. There's no question. The student doesn't know what they're being asked. So always make the STEM a complete question. Again, take note. Always make the STEM a complete question. So instead, please avoid having a fill in the blanks question in your STEM. Again, always make the STEM a complete question, ending with a question mark. Rule number 16. Use none of the above only when the correct answer is completely and unambiguously correct. So if you're asking for the best response rather than definitely correct one, none of the above is inappropriate because it implies your answer might be partially wrong. Okay, number 17. Be careful with all of the above. Why? A student who only knows that two of the options are correct can deduce that all of the above is the answer without actually knowing whether the third option is correct. So, this rewards partial knowledge, which defeats the purpose of assessing. And rule number 18, use none of the above and all of the above sparingly. Or better yet, don't use them at all. So, what do you mean by this? Seldom you use this none of the above or all of the above, seldom na or better not to use them at all. So, rule number 19. Having compound response choices may purposely increase difficulty. The more homogeneous the options, the more difficult the item. Again, the more homogeneous your options, the harder the item. So, compare this to, in an easy version, the options for where is Thailand includes Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, South America. Only one is plausible. So, in a hard version, all of the options are neighboring Asia countries. Laos, China, India, Malaya. So, all are believable. So, when the structures are similar and equally plausible, the item becomes genuinely challenging. So, that's a good test design. Okay, before we delve into matching type test, please also take note of writing in multiple choice. Your letters should be in capital letters. Again, your options like A, B, C, D, your options or the letters of your options should be in capital letters, not small letters. Okay, let's last 5 rules for or the rules in matching type test. Now we have this. So as they successfully match items, so the available choices in column B are, for example, now we move to matching type test. Think of it as a modified multiple choice, but instead of options listed beneath each question, students should match items from one column to items in another column. So as they successfully match items, the available choices in column B get smaller. So the level of difficulty changes as they go through the test. So one important limitation, matching tests typically assess lower order thinking skills like recall, recognition, and so on. So they're good for testing knowledge of names, definitions, dates, and simple relationships. But it's very difficult to assess higher order thinking skills like analysis or judgment with a matching type format. So guideline number 1, match only homogeneous items like column A and column B must belong to the same category. So if you're matching literary works to authors, everything in both columns should be about literature. Don't mix in nationalities or birth years. That makes some choices obviously wrong, which removes the challenge. So, guideline number 2. Put the longer items in column A, the STEM column, and the shorter answers in column B. So, it's faster and easier for students to scan short answers than long ones. And guideline number 3. Column B must have more items than column A. So, if they have the same number, a student who matches all others correctly can get the last answer by elimination without knowing it. So, extra items in column B eliminate that shortcut. Guideline number 4. Arrange column B alphabetically or chronologically. So, this prevents the arrangement itself from hinting at the answer and makes it faster for students to scan. And guideline number 5. Always provide clear directions. So, students must know exactly what to do, and specifically whether an answer in column B can be used more than once. Okay. This brings us to a key distinction, the perfect matching versus the imperfect matching. In perfect matching, each answer in column B is used exactly once and cannot be repeated. Column B has more items than column A to prevent elimination guessing. So, students match 1 to 1. In imperfect matching, answers may be repeated. This is clearly stated in the direction. Something like an answer may be repeated. So, this is actually useful when you want to test conceptual groupings. For example, multiple works of the same author or multiple events from the same time period. So, on the left, you see an example of perfect matching, like Philippine historical figures match to their roles. Column B has extra items like Antonio Luna that are not answers to a question. Those are there specifically to prevent guessing by elimination. So, on the right, the imperfect matching example involves American literature, and because some answers may repeat, students must actually know the content rather than relying on the process of elimination. So, the key takeaway is I always state in your directions whether answers can be repeated. Never leave students guessing about the rules of the test itself. Again, always state in your direction whether answers can be repeated. Never leave students guessing about the rules of the test itself. That is applicable in all types of tests. Instructions should be given clearly and brief and concise instruction. Alright, we're shifting now from selected response type to supply type test. So, this is also called constructed response test. So, instead of choosing from given options, students have to produce their own answer. So, the most basic form of this is the completion test. Like a sentence with a blank that students fill in. So, the simplest example, the study of life and living organism is called blank. That is biology. So, now, completion tests are often associated with lower order thinking skills like recall and memory. But section 5.4.1 shows us that with creative construction, completion test can actually assess higher order thinking skills. So, look at the synonym example. Write an appropriate synonym for metamorphose. 6 letters. The blanks tell you how many letters the answer has. Students must know the meaning of the metamorphose and think of the word change. That's not mere memorization. It's genuine vocabulary understanding. Or the math comparison example. Write G if the left item is greater, L if less, E if equal, D if cannot be determined. Then it gives pairs of values to compare, like square root of 9 versus -3, or 36 inches versus 3 meters. So this requires actual mathematical reasoning and unit conversion. Definitely higher order thinking skills. So remember, even simple test formats can be elevated with thoughtful construction. Okay, here are the 5 guidelines for constructing good completion test. So rule number 1, avoid over mutilated sentences. So don't put so many blanks that students have no idea what's being asked. So like the bad example, the blank produced by the blank is used by the green blank to change the blank and blank into blank. This process is called blank. So can anyone tell me what that sentence is asking? Diba exactly, you can tell me. So there's barely a sentence left. So the blanks outnumber the words. A student reading this has absolutely no context to work with. So give enough clues so that a student knows the content, can actually demonstrate that knowledge. So, rule number 2, avoid open-ended items. There must be one and only one correct answer. So, bad example, Ernest Hemingway wrote blank. Hemingway wrote dozens of works. So, which one are you looking for? So, the item has no single correct answer. It's impossible to grade fairly. Okay, rule number 3. Put the blank at the end of the sentence or near the end. So, bad example. Blank is the process by which plants produce food using sunlight. So, the blank comes before the question is even fully asked. So, better, plants produce food using sunlight through the process called blank. Now, the student reads the complete question because before needing the provide answer. Again, put the blank at the end of the sentence, not in the beginning of the sentence. Rule number 4. Ask about significant information, not trivia. So, for example, the bad example, Jose Rizal was born on June blank 1861. So, who cares about the exact date of birth? So, a better question is, Jose Rizal wrote the novel blank. That's more educationally meaningful, actually. Rule number 5. Make all blanks the same length. So, if a longer blank hints at longer items or longer answers, students will use the blank size as a clue. So again, all blanks should be uniform in size, regardless of the expected answer. Okay, now let's move on to the essays. This is classified as a non-objective test, meaning it is not scored the same way by every teacher. So, two teachers can read the same essay and give different grades. So, that subjectivity is both a feature and a challenge, or strength and a weakness. So, the major strength of essays is that they can assess higher order thinking skills like analyze, synthesize, evaluation, application, and so on. So students must organize their thoughts, construction arguments, and communicate ideas in a coherent way. So that's a more richer form of assessment. Okay, now there are two main types of essays. First one is the restricted or short essay, and the other one is the non-restricted essay or the extended essay. Let's explain the restricted or short essay. So this type of essay, students are given very specific limited task. Example, write an example of blah 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 blah. List 3 reasons why blah 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 blah. Compare and contrast two techniques blah blah blah. Look at the example or look at the sample for a 10th grade class. How are the scrub jay and the mockingbird different? Support your answer with details from the article. So, it focused, bounded, and directly test a specific skill, which is a comparison. Okay. In the non-restricted or extended essay, students have a more freedom to organize and develop their response. So, it can be much longer and more complex. So, the sample for 5th grade science asks students to evaluate a demonstration design and explain improvements. Notice the two parts. Part A identifies actions. Part B explains the reasoning. So that involves higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, like analysis and evaluation. Essays are powerful tools. They must be constructed and scored carefully, which bring us to the guidelines. Okay, rule number 1. Give clear directions that guide students on what to include. So don't just say, summarize the article. Tell them what a complete response look like. Okay, rule number 2. Tell students the grading criteria before the tests. Again, tell the students the grading criteria before the test. If students are going to write an essay or on photosynthesis, tell them in advance. You'll be graded in coherence, accuracy, use of words, and clarity. So, this isn't cheating. This is not cheating. It's fair assessment. Students can focus their preparation on what actually matters. Rule number 3. Set a time limit. So without a time limit, students either rush or overthink. So with a time limit, they must plan their time, decide how much to write for each question, and stay organized. So it also creates consistency across all students. Rule number 4. Decide on your grading system before you start grading. Again, decide on your grading system before you start grading. So, create your rubric, your scoring guide, before you even pick up the first paper. So, if you make grading decisions as you go, your standards will shift from student to student. And that's unfair. Rule number 5. Grade all students' answers to question 1 before moving on to question 2. So, this keeps your standard consistent across papers. So, if you grade one student's entire test at a time, your standard may shift from the time you reach the last student. Okay. Rule number 6. So, grade essays anonymously. So, have the students write their names on the back of the paper or use code numbers. You should not know whose paper you're grading. Why? Because we are all human. If we know a student is usually strong or usually weak, that knowledge will subconsciously influence how you will interpret their writing. So, grade the work, not the person. Okay, rule number 7. Whenever possible, there are 2 or more teachers grade the same essay independently. So, this is especially important when the result determines something significant, like placement in a special program, a scholarship, or a major award. Again, multiple readers reduce personal bias and increasingly the reliable score. Okay, rule number 8. Do not offer optional questions. Answer any 3 out of 5 questions might seem kind, but it means different students are answering different tests. Question 1 might be harder than question 4. So, you may no longer fairly compare scores. If it's an assessment, everyone should answer the same question. Okay, rule number 9. Tell students the value of each question before they start. If question 1 is worth 30 points and question number 2 is worth 10 points, students need to know so they can allocate time and effort accordingly. So, withholding this information and holding this information creates unnecessary stress and leads to poorly balanced responses. Okay, rule number 10. Emphasize higher order thinking skills. That's what essays are for. Don't waste them on recall questions. Like, for example, the bad. List 3 coastal land masses. That's a recall question. Use a different test type for that. Which is good? Or what is the good side? Explain why coastal areas have more moderate temperature than inland areas at the same latitude. So, that requires understanding and application. That's a worthy essay question. Okay. Alright, everyone. Let's bring it all together. 5.2 or section 5.2, paper and pencil test require careful planning. Different types are suited to different levels of thinking. Section 5.31, true or false test. Now, remember the 8 rules. Avoid guessing clues, absolute words, long sentences, trick items, verbatim quotes, answer patterns, and double negatives. Section 5.3.2, multiple choice, the 19 rules that all center on one principle. Difficulty should come from the subject matter, not from confusing wording. So watch your distractors, your stems, your grammar, and your option design. Section 5.3.3, matching tests. Perfect version, imperfect matching, homogeneous items, and always provide clear directions. 5.4.1, completion test. 5 rules: don't over-mutilate, don't leave open-ended answers, put the blank near the end, ask about significant content, and make all blanks uniform. Section 5.4.2, essays, the 10 rules. Give criteria up front, grade anonymously, don't offer choices, grade one question at a time across all papers, and target higher order thinking skills. So the bottom line is this: a good test is one that fairly and accurately measures what students know, nothing more, nothing less. So when tests are poorly constructed, they stop measuring knowledge and start measuring luck. So test wiseness or reading speed, and that serves no one. So as future educators, you have the power and the responsibility to build assessments that are meaningful, fair, and rigorous. So use these rules as your toolkit. So any questions before we wrap up? So your questions should be given or should be raised in our face-to-face sessions. So great job for today, everyone, and see you all in our face-to-face sessions.